My goal today is to talk about why I think our policy in East Asia has been successful and why I hope the Obama administration will continue with the basic framework that's in place, particularly for the China piece of the Asia policy. And I'll say at the outset that our success in Asia has been really rather remarkable if you look at the history of the region, and somewhat for reasons that might not jump out at you if you don't follow it on a day-to-day basis like they do in the State Department. One of the reasons is that we have very good relations with China, with Japan, and with India all at the same time. And that is a remarkable achievement in and of itself. And that's a big chunk of the world, and that's a big chunk of the world's population, and a big chunk of the world's GNP. But what's not noted as often as that basic fact is that China and Japan and China and India have good bilateral relations, and India and Japan have good bilateral relations. So you have good bilateral relations among those three powers. And that is something that would have been hard to expect if you're trying to guess what the world would look like today, maybe 10, 15 years ago. That the United States would have good relations with all three at once, and they'd all have good relations with each other. U.S. China relations recently have been very good, I believe, and the U.S. government has made progress on a range of issues by helping to shape the way that the Chinese government chooses to use its increasing influence in the world. And there are lots of problems in U.S. China relations, and if you look at U.S. China relations as a snapshot, those problems will jump out at you. And you'll see, oh, things don't look so good. But what I would like to do is to invite you to look at the relationship over time as a movie instead of as a snapshot. And I think you'll see that relations are moving in a positive direction. And perhaps most important, China is adopting policies that would have been hard to predict several years ago today. Is it perfect from an American perspective? No, very far from it. But is it improving over time in a positive direction? I would say it is, and I would say that that's largely due to constructive policies in Washington and in other capitals around the world in dealing with the implications of a China whose influence is rising in the region and around the world. Now, there's a consensus in China as a backdrop point. I would just say there's a consensus in China that China should have increasing influence around the world. This is widely held in the Chinese government and in the Chinese society, and that's an important fact to recognize. The real debate and the real question within China is how should China pursue that increased influence? What tools should it use? What strategies should it use? And how should it acquire that increased influence? What tools and strategies should it use to acquire that increased influence? And there, I think we can make a difference in trying to shape the choices that China makes with its growing influence to encourage patterns in which China seeks increased influence through positive and constructive economic and diplomatic policies, and eschews policies that would be destabilizing to the region and to the rest of the world. Most of my talk today about how the United States can do that will focus on diplomatic relations. I was most closely involved with those. But I want to say at the outset that a big part of our overall strategy, a very, very important part of our overall strategy, is maintaining a very strong U.S. presence in Asia. That's economic, political, and military. We need to have a very strong security presence in Asia, strong U.S. military presence in Asia, strong U.S. security alliances and relationships that are not alliances in the region with countries like Japan, with countries like Singapore, South Korea, Thailand, the Philippines, etc. We need to have that network of security relationships so that we can better shape the choices that China makes. Because what we don't want to see is Chinese elites and citizens to get we don't want them to get the impression that the best way for China to increase its influence in the region and around the world is through coercion and through military force. So that's a very important part of the strategy. I won't spend a lot of time on it today, but I don't want you to forget that part, and maybe we can talk more about it later in the Q&A period. The second major component of the strategy is a diplomatic strategy, and that is a series of dialogues that we have with the Chinese on a broad range of political and economic issues, and I think that this very robust set of dialogues has been successful. They include a very large set of economic dialogues and political dialogues. There are two famous ones. The Strategic Economic Dialogue headed up by Secretary of Treasury Henry Paulson, and the Senior Dialogue, which deals with security and political affairs, headed by Deputy Secretary of State John Negroponte. There are, under those two big umbrella dialogues, a very large series of dialogues, as I said. I can't name them all. There are many dozens of them. And there are sub-dialogues within them as well that I don't have time to describe. I just say at the outset that these are real dialogues. These are not the United States telling China what to do. We listen to the Chinese about their views on international economics, on diplomacy, etc., because China has an increasing portfolio of experiences around the world in diplomacy and in economics, and we have a lot to learn from our Chinese counterparts. We, of course, do push our views and try to say what we think is the best way to move forward together or for China individually to move forward. But we do listen to the Chinese side about their experiences in places like Africa, where in many cases their experiences are different, yet they're quite robust. I think these dialogues have worked in large part because they follow three basic principles, and some of these principles flow from each other, and I'll just lay them out here at this point. The first is that the United States is not trying to contain the growth of Chinese influence, but rather to shape the choices that China makes with that increasing influence. This is a very important point to constantly drive home in our approach to Beijing. Because of the history, because of the sense that China has that maybe great powers will try to keep them down, it's something that we consistently need to remind our Chinese counterparts of in these discussions so that they understand that the advice is coming out of the spirit of cooperation and trying to coordinate our activities more closely around the world. This is obviously true in our economic dialogues where we wish the Chinese economy well. I think we've seen in recent weeks that our economies are interconnected, and what's good for one economy is good for the other, and what's bad for one economy is bad for the other. But it's definitely driven home in the security dialogues as well, and that's a point that we need to continue to pursue or push in the future. A second basic principle flows from the first, and that is that the growth of U.S. and Chinese influence around the world is not a zero-sum competition or a zero-sum game. It is not the case that if China increases its influence in Southeast Asia, in Africa, or Latin America, that this comes at U.S. expense, nor is the reverse the case. And this is something, again, that we need to drive home to the Chinese. I think this is true in our economic and security discussions, and as I'll point out later, I believe it's true in other aspects of our relationship, including human rights, where people don't necessarily see it this way. But I think it's very much the case that if China improves its human rights image by improving its human rights conditions at home, it will benefit as well as other actors benefiting from that situation. The third basic principle is that our bilateral discussions are increasingly about topics other than the traditional bilateral issues in the relationship. And those traditional bilateral issues will be familiar to many people in the room. They include Taiwan, trade deficits, human rights, etc. But increasingly our dialogues are about those issues, but a whole raft of new issues. And that is a discussion of third areas around the world in which the United States and China should increase our cooperation and our coordination so as to better stabilize the international security environment and lead to a better economic prospect for sustained development around the world. And this really is new in the relationship. And we have a series of sub-dialogues as part of the senior dialogue that people may not know about. Those sub-dialogues deal with regions around the world outside of the U.S.-China bilateral relationship, whether it be in Northeast Asia, whether it be in Africa, Latin America. And in those dialogues, you have meetings between our assistant secretaries of state and their Chinese counterparts, usually assistant foreign ministers, who deal with those areas of the world. And I would say 10 or 15 years ago, these people wouldn't know each other's names necessarily, let alone sit around for a day or 2 days and discuss how to better stabilize various regions of the world for the mutual benefit of both the United States and the PRC. And I think this is a real innovation in the relationship. I think it takes a lot of capital, it takes a lot of time to get these very busy people to do this, and I hope that the next administration will continue with this approach to the relationship, which has really big benefits for the bilateral relationship itself. It helps build that sense of trust. It helps build that sense that the U.S. initiatives are not designed to undermine China's influence, but rather to invite China to play a larger role on the international stage. The whole notion of a responsible stakeholder, which was laid out as an aspirational goal by Deputy Secretary Robert Zoellick, before I came into the government, is an invitation for China to play a larger role on the international stage, not a smaller role, to be more influential, not less influential. And it's that spirit that I think drives the policy initiatives of the current administration, and I hope that continues into the next. So in the political security realm, what we're asking China to do, what we have been asking China to do, and what we should continue to ask China to do, is to shoulder a bigger part of the burden of stabilizing the international space in security and economics. And China arguably has not shouldered the full burden of an international globalization, of stabilizing an international globalization process from which China has benefited greatly. Arguably no country has benefited more than China since 1978-79 from that process. So the idea is to ask China to do more again on the international stage to help shoulder that burden. In terms of economics, if we look at China's quote-unquote inroads into Africa or Latin America, there's been a lot written about that. A lot of things are written from a sort of zero-sum perspective, that somehow if China gives more aid or has more investment in Africa or Latin America, that this necessarily comes as a challenge or constitutes a challenge to U.S. national interests. And this is really not the case at all. It's not the view of the U.S. government when we look at those investments and my view is that the U.S. government, I have to be careful here, my view is that the U.S. government doesn't view it that way. When I was in the government, we certainly didn't portray it that way. And the basic idea there is that the Chinese should invest even more in Africa. The Chinese should give even more aid in Africa. But what China should do is coordinate its aid and investment policies with the aid policies of the major donors around the world and the IMF, so that we get more bang for the buck or more renminbi for the buck, whichever you prefer, so that we get better results in Africa and in the developing world than we would if we acted in isolation and if we accidentally or intentionally undercut each other's policies through policies that were not compatible with each other. And this has a lot to do with good governance and the Millennium Challenge goals set out by the Bush administration, which have been quite successful and are quite constructive. So the idea there would be to coordinate better, and we have asked the Chinese government to set up a new dialogue on assistance with the leaders of those policies in both capitals. And I'm personally hopeful that that will happen, I hope sooner rather than later. And I think that would be a constructive thing both for the bilateral relationship and for the targets in question in the developing world. So we can judge the success of our engagement based on real policies. And I'm going to run through some real policies. And again, there are real problems in all of these policies that I'm going to discuss. But what I want you to do is to think about the long history of U.S. China relations, the long history of China's foreign relations with various parts of the world, the various principles that have informed the PRC's foreign policy towards various parts of the world, and try to imagine that China would have adopted some of the policies that it's adopted in the last 4 or 5 years from that viewpoint. And I think it's hard to do. I've studied Chinese foreign policy for most of my adult life, and I think it would have been hard to predict that China adopted some of the policies that it's adopted in the last few years from that traditional historical perspective. The first is the six-party talks, where China has played a leadership role in hosting the six-party talks on North Korean denuclearization, but it has done much more than play a host's role. It has pushed forward the process on several key occasions. It has helped draft and has signed UN Security Council resolutions that put sanctions on China's traditional ally in North Korea. It has helped break logjams, specific logjams in the negotiating process, and I had the privilege of being involved in 2 rounds of the six-party talks with my boss, Ambassador Chris Hill. And I can say that, on a personal level and on an intellectual level, it was really gratifying to see how well these 2 very skilled diplomats, Ambassador Hill on the American side and Ambassador Wu Dawei on the Chinese side, dealt with the problems that they faced and how the Chinese contributed actively in breaking logjams in that process. And again, I think this would have been very hard to imagine just several years ago. A second issue is Sudan-Darfur. And this is an issue that gets a lot of media coverage in the United States and around the world, China's policy toward this issue. And I can say that in the 2 years that I was in the government, I saw a very big change in China's policy towards Sudan and Darfur that isn't always recognized in that media coverage, and I think it's important to point out. When I first got on the job, I saw China's foreign policy towards Sudan and Darfur as, frankly, quite bad, terrible, you might say. And I was quite vocal about it whenever I had an opportunity to speak about it, because basically what China was saying was that if the international community wants to put pressure on Khartoum, China was going to defend Khartoum from that pressure. And that was not a constructive position at all. But over the following 2 years, we saw a shift in China's policy. In the fall of 2006, China began supporting the three-phase Annan plan for stabilization and peace in Darfur. In the early part of 2007, China started to push the regime in Khartoum to accept the second phase of that three-phase plan to get the infrastructure in place so that a larger peacekeeping force could come into Darfur. And in the spring of that year, following one of our sub-dialogues, China agreed to send peacekeepers to Darfur. It now has sent over 300 engineering troops to Darfur. That constitutes the first non-African peacekeeping force in Darfur. That took a while to get into place, but they are now in place. They came under threat, and China kept them on the ground in Darfur to build the infrastructure for an eventual larger force. There are still big problems in China's Darfur policy. I believe, as an outside observer, and when I was in the government, we believed that China could do more, and I still believe that China could do more, but it could also do less. It could stop selling conventional arms to the government in Sudan while this genocide is ongoing. But I think there has been a big change in China's policy, and I don't think it was fully the work of Mia Farrow and Steven Spielberg that brought about this change. And I think that this type of diplomatic engagement has payoff, and we need to continue to work along these lines. In Burma, there are more problems still. And again, as in Darfur, I believe that China can do a lot more in Burma to help lead to long-term stability there. And I think it has correctly been, justifiably been criticized for its policy towards Burma in some of the recent events there. But China has, again, adjusted its policy towards Burma in very meaningful and important ways in a positive direction. Not nearly far enough, but in a positive direction. And that needs to be noted if you're going to try to get further progress in the future. And that is that right after an ASEAN statement criticizing the Burmese regime for its crackdown at home against the monks and others, China called publicly for domestic reconciliation in Burma between the government and the domestic opposition and the minorities in Burma. This is something that would have been hard to predict several years ago because of the traditional principle in PRC foreign policy, which is that China does not interfere in the internal affairs of states with whom China has good relations. And that's a long statement, but each element of it is important. China does not interfere in the internal affairs of states with whom China has good relations. And China has traditionally had good relations with the regime in Burma. Yet it spoke out and said that for the sake of long-term stability, the Burmese regime needs to seek real reconciliation with its domestic opposition and its ethnic minorities. Is that enough? No, not close to enough. But it is a movement in a positive direction. That movement away from a rigid non-interference principle in China's foreign policy will be very important moving forward. It's something that the United States intellectual community, the government, and others needs to track. Because increasingly our problems in security affairs and in economic affairs are going to have to do with factors that are related to the domestic governance of states around the world. It's a very interdependent network, and we can't simply say that policy prescriptions stop at the border of these various countries. That's true in the war on terror, that's true in economic affairs, it's true in a whole range of things. Whereas if China is going to play a larger role and a responsible role on the international stage, it's going to have to soften and eventually move away from that hard principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other states. Another place where we've sought cooperation with China, and I would say that the record is even more mixed in a negative direction, is the issue of Iran and Iran's pursuit of highly enriched uranium technologies in what the international community agrees is in violation of its own commitments as part of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's very important that Iran be given a very clear set of messages from the international community that this is unacceptable behavior. And on that score, the P5+1 process, in which the United States and China are both involved, has been a good network for putting pressure on Iran. And it has produced some results. There's been 3 UN Security Council resolutions with sanctions. And again, it might have been hard several years ago to imagine China signing on to those types of sanctions resolutions. The problem with the process is that it's too slow, and there's a lot of foot dragging in the process. And we need China to be more nimble and more proactive as part of that P5+1 process. And in addition, China has sent what are contradictory signals when we look at that P5+1 process and the pressure that it's trying to bring to bear on Iran at a time that it's in violation of the international community's demands. By seeking new economic relationships, continuing with existing economic relationships and seeking new economic relationships, in particular new investments in the energy sector in Iran, which I believe as an outside observer, and we believe when in the U.S. government, sends the wrong signal to Iran at this time. It's not that China should never have any relationship with Iran forever, or that China shouldn't get any energy from Iran. But at a time when you're putting on what amount to real but rather limited sanctions to be cutting new energy deals, we believe sends that wrong signal, and I believe that to this day. In the economic sphere, we have a very robust set of dialogues, and there are some real concerns on the economic side about China's behavior and about the U.S. China relationship. And some of those concerns are legitimate. Some of them aren't, I would argue. And I'd just say as a backdrop that there's a very large trade deficit between the United States and the PRC. I would also add that almost every economist would tell you that bilateral trade deficits don't matter much to the economies of the 2 countries in question, and that you can survive rather large bilateral trade deficits from an economics perspective between 2 countries without too much difficulty, and that it is rather natural for the United States and the PRC to have a large bilateral trade deficit given the international economic structure and the regional economic structure in East Asia. So all that being said, it is the case also that one could argue quite convincingly that the bilateral trade deficit between the United States and China is artificially large, that it could be made smaller through policy prescriptions, and it could be made smaller in ways that would benefit the Chinese economy, which has a real challenge, which is a persistent and growing current account surplus with the world, which is an issue that economists do take very seriously. The U.S. China bilateral trade deficit can be dealt with in a way that also addresses some of those issues. So I do think there's a real issue there. I think that the best way to deal with that issue is through the dialogue structure that we have and through existing international institutions like the WTO, where the United States has brought several cases in recent years against China in a very legalistic, very transparent method of addressing some of the policies that are seen as problematic by the United States, by Europe, and others. And I think that's the better way to go rather than constantly threatening sweeping sanctions or threatening to close off our markets to Chinese products of certain types of products, et cetera, et cetera. That sort of dialogue is a better way to go. And some of the issues that we deal with in those dialogues are very interesting from an intellectual perspective and should help deal with some of the problems over time. One of the issues that people list in terms of why the bilateral trade deficit is artificially large is the currency issue, that China's currency is undervalued. Another is IPR enforcement, that China isn't enforcing intellectual property rights, which harms U.S. innovators and manufacturers of intellectual property. There's also subsidies to export companies, firms in China to keep jobs in those areas that are arguably violations of WTO rules, and those issues can be dealt with. But there are broader macro issues in the Chinese economy that can be dealt with as well, again, to deal with not only the bilateral trade deficit with the United States, but also the current account surplus that China runs with the entire world. And that is to try to encourage China to set up a better social safety net at home, to increase domestic consumption at home, and to allow a larger percentage of the population to get involved in the innovative economy. And pretty much all of the suggestions that I saw made to the Chinese, I would say all of them, were not just suggestions that would somehow help U.S. manufacturers, although they would, some directly, some more indirectly over time, but would help the Chinese economy stabilize itself and to grow in a healthy fashion long into the future. And that was the spirit of the discussions. And I think in general, from a political point of view, that's a much better way to engage the Chinese government than to say, you owe us something, you must do X, Y, and Z, because you owe the United States, its manufacturers, its workers, some kind of prize. It's much better to say, we have a mutual interest in these outcomes. And if you adopt these policies, it'll be good for your economy, it'll be good for our bilateral economic relationship, and it will be good for our overall bilateral relationship moving forward. So a better social safety net, why does that matter? Because one of the reasons that Chinese citizens save so much is that they don't have that kind of social safety net, those kind of health insurance and welfare fallback positions that are fairly widespread throughout the West. And if they did, the argument runs that they would be willing to spend some marginal additional amount of their income on consumer goods. Some of those consumer goods will be foreign, and that should have a positive impact on the things we're discussing. How have these things worked? And this is something that I really think has been missed in the mainstream media. This approach, the WTO cases, that they have teeth, right? So it's not all talk and it's not all soft persuasion. Combined with that kind of dialogue has produced real results. And if you look at the recent history of U.S. China economic relations, dating back to a very good starting point when China joined the WTO as a member, which was something that was pushed through by the previous administration and by this administration, you see that U.S. exports to China have grown 5 times faster than our exports to the rest of the world, and that China has become our 3rd largest export market. In 2006, which was a year that I tracked very carefully because it's when I entered the job, exports to China grew twice as fast as our imports from China. And this is no longer a small pie. We're talking many tens of billions of dollars in exports, which is many jobs for Americans. We've also established more air routes to China, something that's good for commerce. We've had nuclear energy sales, which are arguably good for the environment, as well as for American producers. And we've had the foundation of increasing cooperation. I say the foundation of it because we're really dealing with it for the first time. Food safety and product safety, something that's very clearly in the interest of both countries. It's in China's interest to export safe products. It's in the U.S. interest to import safe products. And there's no clearer example of an issue that is a positive-sum issue for the two sides. And to get much more experienced U.S. inspectors into China to look at the factories, to look at the problems that they have, to try to get the Chinese government to have more attention to this issue and more capacity in this issue is clearly in the interest of both countries. Something like intellectual property rights. Why would it be in China's interest to protect intellectual property rights? Why do I say that that's something that's in China's economic interest, not just in America's economic interest? Because if China wants to have an innovative economy moving forward, it's going to have to protect intellectual property rights, not just of foreigners, but of domestic Chinese producers. And China has a burgeoning software industry, if it could get some protections for their products. And it should have a very innovative economy moving forward. It has an increasingly educated population. And even if only a small percentage of the Chinese population have engineering degrees, it's a very large population. So a small percentage produces a lot of innovation. So for China's own good, and lots of Chinese elites understand this, they're going to have to protect intellectual property in ways that will benefit U.S. manufacturers moving forward. So this type of dialogue, I think, is the way to go. Open dialogue with the Chinese on economic issues is a much better way than constantly threatening protection of the U.S. market, and particularly in financial hard times. The temptation to protect the U.S. market is going to go up. And it's very important, I believe, for the next administration to resist those easy solutions, which aren't solutions at all, to economic problems, and to keep the U.S. markets open. If you look at the history of financial crises and economic crises, the leading economy keeping its markets open is a big part of the solution to problems, and the leading economy closing off markets is a big exacerbating factor in those problems. So there will be those temptations if we run into economic hard times or if the current economic hard times continue, and I hope that those temptations can be resisted. That's important for the economic relationship, and it's important for the political and security relationship as well, because that economic relationship really is a foundation of the overall bilateral relationship. Now, there are some really big problems that remain out there, and I'm not ignoring them here. There are big problems even in the issues that I listed as flagship examples of progress in China's foreign relations. There are big problems. But I'll list some of the other problems that I see, and then I will open it up to questions. One is on human rights and religious freedom. And I'll be very frank here. We dealt with this issue very intensely for years, and I don't think we made the progress that we hoped to make. I'll just put it that way. It's disappointing. In the spring of 2008, we were able to restart the human rights dialogue. I participated in that dialogue. It was hard to get restarted. We got it restarted. I think the dialogue was very good, very constructive, put in the right spirit, which in the right spirit of dealing with human rights is like the same spirit you deal with these other issues, which is that it's in China's own interest to have an improved human rights situation. It's in China's own interest to have religious freedom. Why? Because you have to have some sort of media that can report on problems, on corruption, etc., if you want to deal with those issues in a sustained and serious way. Right? And President Hu Jintao has said he wants a harmonious society. He hasn't specified that this is one of the roots to it, but it's certainly consistent with that goal to say you want to have a free media and a free academic environment to criticize policies, open debate, if you want to have stability, innovation moving forward. And if you want to have social stability in various places in the countryside and in the cities, you have to have legitimate outlets for frustration and disappointment and criticism of the government if you're going to release that steam in a stable way. I think, again, there are Chinese elites who understand this, and I'm hopeful that in the future we can make some progress on this, this aspect, this very important aspect of the bilateral relationship, but it has been quite disappointing to date. And in the run-up to the Olympics, since the Olympics, we just haven't seen the kind of progress that we would expect an enlightened set of leaders in China to adopt, both for China's international image and for China's long-term domestic stability. Military modernization. The military modernization in China is quite fast. It's quite impressive. It's faster than the economic growth itself, which is very impressive indeed. And one of the problems with the military modernization from an American perspective is that there's a lack of transparency in it. We see new weapon systems, new ideas coming into the Chinese security environment, but we learn about them in kind of haphazard ways. The most dramatic example of this was the January 2007 anti-satellite test, where China, without warning the international community, blew up one of its own satellites in low Earth orbit, causing huge debris and also shocking many, as they say, spacefaring countries around the world. It's still a word I'm not used to saying, but it makes sense. Seafaring, spacefaring, why not? Lots of countries, not just the United States, have satellites in that belt, and this was a concerning policy. And China's developing new military equipment, new weapon systems, and what other countries will want to know as China does this is what are the doctrinal implications of these new systems? Is China going to change its strategy in some significant way that will pose a bigger challenge to its neighbors? China says it wants to have peaceful rise, wants to reassure its neighbors. Well, one way to do that as you increase your military power is to get involved in dialogue with your neighbors and with other great powers around the world about what you're up to. And this is something that we worked on in the U.S. government, and there are some new dialogues set up by the Pentagon in the last couple of years on nuclear strategy and other issues. And I think that that's a good way to move forward on this. It's not an unsolvable problem. I don't want to make it seem like China is somehow inherently mysterious and we'll never understand it. I don't believe that. But we do need to talk about these issues with our Chinese counterparts, and that needs to be pursued. Unfortunately, the current, the recently founded dialogues have been shut down by the Chinese side, I hope temporarily, I trust temporarily, in protest for U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. I think that this is not a very good response by Beijing. This is something that serves both our countries' interests to have these dialogues, and I don't think it's a very healthy response to what I see as a very understandable policy of selling those arms to Taiwan, and I wanted to talk about that briefly as well. China's military buildup across from the Taiwan Strait is, in my opinion, and is in the U.S. government's view when I was there, as a force for instability in cross-strait relations. We've seen real improvements in cross-strait relations recently with a new government in Taiwan and dialogue across the strait between the mainland and Taiwan on a range of issues. This is all positive from a U.S. perspective, I believe. But that military challenge to Taiwan has not been reduced in any noticeable way that I can see. And in addition, a lot more needs to be done on the political side in cross-strait relations. And if the mainland is too conservative in this period in which you have in place in Taiwan a leadership that has a very moderate approach to cross-strait relations toward the mainland, if that moderate approach in Taiwan cannot show real results, and I don't just mean here charter flights and greater economic integration, I mean on the political side and on the security side, where that Taiwan leadership can't say we are now safer for the long run from a military security perspective, and we are more respected in a political sense by increasing Taiwan's international space, and there's various ways that Taiwan can do that. It can participate fully in international organizations for which statehood is not a requirement, and it can participate quite actively, although it cannot gain membership under current conditions. It cannot gain membership in those organizations. It can participate quite actively in organizations for which statehood is a requirement. It can get observer status. It can be involved in technical meetings. And that's going to require a degree of flexibility and imagination on the mainland that we haven't seen to date. I am hopeful, because I'm an optimistic person, I am hopeful that we can convince Beijing to adopt such an approach. But if Beijing doesn't adopt such an approach, Taiwan is a democracy, and the danger is that the moderate approach to the mainland may not continue to gain the support of the Taiwan public, where there is a broad consensus that Taiwan deserves more respect on the international stage and more international space, and there's a broad consensus that the build-up across from Taiwan is counterproductive and dangerous. I think U.S. policy towards cross-strait relations is a nice way to end the talk, because I think it's a microcosm of the general approach that I'm laying out. I gave a speech on September 11, 2007 about Taiwan's defense and about our policy towards cross-strait relations. And I still believe in the elements of that speech. And in that speech, I said that what we really need to do is have a strong and moderate Taiwan, and that there's no contradiction between a U.S. policy that abides by the Taiwan Relations Act and sells Taiwan the defensive capabilities it needs to deal with the mainland from a position of confidence and strength, and a policy at the same time that discourages Taiwan from taking unnecessarily provocative political and diplomatic postures toward the mainland, and therefore unnecessarily increases tensions across the Taiwan Strait. So we need Taiwan to be strong and moderate in the same way that we need all of the actors around the international scene, the United States, some of the East Asian major powers, and smaller powers alike, to take a position of strength and moderation towards the mainland. Why? Because that approach is the best way to shape the choices that China is going to make moving forward. And the choices that China makes with its increasing influence will have huge repercussions for global stability and for international economic development. So I think that approach is right for cross-strait relations, and I think the philosophy behind that approach in cross-strait relations is the same philosophy that should be applied to powers around the world that deal with China moving forward. You need to come at it from strength, and you need to be moderate and constructive in how you utilize that strength. And you need to recognize that there is a broad consensus in China that China should increase its influence around the world, and that this is not necessarily a bad thing if China uses its influence. It's probably a good thing if China uses that influence for positive goals rather than negative goals. So I'll just stop there. I've talked for too long, as is my wont. They let me work in the government, but I'm still an academic, so I still give speeches that are too long. And I will take questions happily. Okay. Sir.
It's very clear that there is a soft approach to China simply by recognizing the strength of China, both military and economic strength of China as well in the last 2 to 3 decades. Certainly America will not deal like this with Iran or any other country which is military weak, and you will talk to them, give them a tough talk.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to China, I won't use that word. The human rights, the issue which is looming large all over China,
Mm-hmm.
is a part of that issue. If you improve the democracy, if you bring democracy into China, then only you can expect all these things to change.
Mm-hmm.
I would like you to comment about why this kind of double standard approach and that what is the reason behind this?
Okay.
The second point I want to point is that you are completely overlooked the environmental policy issue of China.
Mm-hmm.
China is the rapid industrialization and economic growth is ruining global environment. It is causing enormous amount of damage to the environment. And somehow nobody should even, at least U.S. doesn't bring any pressure on China to take care of this environment and contribute to global environment.
Okay. All right, thanks. There's two excellent questions. I'll do them in reverse order. First of all, environmental policy is front and center in the strategic economic dialogue. I participated in every round to date. It was the only issue, energy and the environment, that was in every round front and center. And Secretary Paulson is a devoted environmentalist. He has a long record on this. He has very good ideas about how China should deal with this. We are setting up, when I was in the government, as part of this effort, the U.S. government was setting up a 10-year framework to deal with the Chinese on energy and the environment. And it was, again, front and center. It's a very difficult problem to deal with. I wouldn't portray it the way that you do, that China is destroying the international environment. Economic growth around the world is destroying the international environment. China's had quite a bit of it recently. And China has a less developed economy and is probably destroying more of the environment per dollar gained, which is something that lots of countries have done in the past at that stage of development. And I think it's the wrong approach to take to say that, somehow this issue is a China issue, and we need to put pressure on China to do this. What we need to do is to come up with creative solutions that involve the United States, which is also a major emitter, and other major emitters. And we've had major summits on this in Washington. And this administration has included China in this discussion for the first time. China and India were left out of the Kyoto process for the most part. And the idea here is you have to recognize that they're major players in this, and you have to include them. And there are various efforts. There was a five-power energy ministerial that involved China as well that I participated in. And I think that this issue does get a tremendous amount of attention. It is actually in my notes, and I didn't mention it. I appreciate the question because it provides me an opportunity to say something about it. But again, we're going to have to solve it together. One of the issues that I touched upon, which is related to this, is intellectual property rights. Because at the end of the day, there's not going to be any long-term sustained solution without technology. And one of the problems is a lot of that technology is going to be made by relatively small firms in the United States and Japan and elsewhere moving forward, I believe, because innovation often starts that way. And those companies are going to want protections for their technologies when they go into China. They're going to want to sell more than one copy of whatever they make. There's rampant piracy. So that's going to be an issue moving forward, and that's the way that these issues are intertwined. But I don't think we should come at it from a hostile position and saying, it's your fault and you need to stop and we need to pressure. I don't think that's going to get us anywhere, for one, and I don't think it's actually the best, most valid intellectual approach to the problem. In terms of liberal democracy, we do talk about it with the Chinese. We talk about it publicly, we talk about it privately. That issue I just think is a non-issue. We point out that moving forward, if China wants to be stable with an increasingly complex society, that we believe from our own experience and from the experience of lots of other countries, that liberal democracy is going to be the way to go. In the near term, we try to deal with some of these issues, rule of law, free press, et cetera, but to the degree that China democratizes, we think it's a good thing, and we're quite upfront about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, we have those dialogues, and we just had the G20, which is the biggest logistics nightmare on the planet, I guarantee you that. To get all these elites into one place and keep them safe is no easy bargain. There was also the Major Economies Initiative, as you know, where we had the Chinese and others and lots of others involved, where we talked about global warming in Washington last year. There are these initiatives, but I think the bilateral piece is also important. And one thing about the strategic economic dialogue is when you walk into the room, you kind of feel like you're at Versailles or something. You have 10 cabinet members on the U.S. side, and you've got 14 ministers on the Chinese side. It's a pretty big production, and it takes a lot of time capital, human capital, to get it all together for these meetings. If you were to have something that large with 10 or 20 countries, it would be really quite stunning. But I take your point, and I think the point about dealing with other countries as well is a positive one, and imitation is the best form of flattery. And I've noted that a lot of countries have set up strategic economic dialogues of their own with China, following the Paulson Initiative. So that's a healthy thing. We don't see this as zero sum. We don't worry that Japan's talking to China, for example. On the financial crisis, I'm not an expert. I don't want to pretend to be. This is an incredibly complicated thing, but I would say that there are a lot of problems. Certainly, a lot of them are here at home, and we heard plenty of it, from our Chinese counterparts about savings, et cetera. They save too much, we save too little, right? In terms of China's holdings of bonds, I think you could say we put the bonds on the market, they bought them. I'm not trying to defend China's position. We put them on the market. Nobody forced anybody to purchase bonds. Nobody forced us to go into debt. And China purchased the bonds. If China didn't purchase the bonds, arguably you could say that it would be worse for us, right? Because we're trying to sell them, and China wouldn't buy them. Well, again, this is I'm getting a little bit in over my head, but I think that purchasing the bonds was one of the ways that they allowed the currency to stay undervalued. But I think, in other words, it was part of that policy. But the bonds had to be on the market to be purchased. So anyway, we can talk about that maybe offline. And again, I'm not a financial expert, and I don't pretend to be. Yeah, in the back there, sir. Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a real problem. I mean, there's a problem in how people understand the problems that we face, and there's a problem in how people understand the solutions to those problems. So if we look at product safety, it's a real problem. It's not exaggerated. It's a real problem not for Americans necessarily. It's a real problem for Chinese. If you look at this melamine thing, it's a disaster. Mothers buying, powdered milk formula and having poison in it because some sleazy producer wants to trick a regulator who's going to check to see how much protein's in the milk. This is a rampant problem in China. Smart Chinese citizens understand this. And the best way to approach these problems is to understand that it's a problem for both of us. That we can't search every single product that comes into the country. We don't have that capability, and nor should we. It would be a disaster if we had that kind of capability. So you have to use scientific methods. You have to do sampling. You have to have experienced people involved in that process. And it's probably better to search some factories before the stuff gets out than to search containers on the open seas or in ports, et cetera. So there's a lot of room for cooperation there. Again, as I said in the talk, it's a clear example of a place where our interests coincide and where we should be able to cooperate. But yes, I do worry that people get the wrong impression and that they misperceive the problem and then they misperceive the solution. And I wanted to say one more thing on the financial piece, because Bob Cohen's question was very interesting. And that is, again, that I think the way to deal with this problem is to convince highly experienced, highly intellectual Chinese elite to work on these problems. And the Chinese government is full of very sophisticated people. That it's just not in China's long-term interests to run these kind of ongoing current account surpluses. And one of the things I didn't say in the talk, but again, it's in my notes, and this provides me an opportunity to say that, is that the Chinese currency has revalued by 20% since 2005. And that's a good thing. Is it fast enough? I don't think so. But is it significant? Yes, it is. And it probably helps explain. It's not the main explanation, but it's one of the explanations for why U.S. exports have increased as quickly as they have. So, I mean, there's ways to deal with these problems. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In the long term, it's not really sustainable for the United States to maintain good relations with both India and China, and ultimately our strategic national interests are better served by siding with India rather than with China, whose long-term interests are probably some of the conflicts of real strategic interests.
Well, I mean, I guess I disagree with the premise of the last part of the question. I do think it's very important for us to have good relations with India, and we do. And they're better than ever. I note that that didn't come at the expense of Indian-Chinese tensions. And in fact, following some of the efforts made by the previous administration and this administration early on to improve relations with India, and they really improved quite dramatically, arguably, in this administration, China has reached out to India in a way that it hadn't in the past. There are still tensions, there are still lots of unresolved problems, but there's increasing trade, there's much more diplomatic activity between the two countries. And I think that that's the kind of positive role that a strong U.S. presence can play, as long as we don't portray the improvement in our relations with India in the way that the second part of your question implied, which is that it must necessarily come at the expense of China, it must necessarily preclude or be based in worsening relations between China and India. If those relations were to worsen, it would be awfully good to have lots of relationships in the region. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to worsen. And I would argue that the strong relationship with India is has a positive effect when properly shaped and properly used as a tool in getting India and China to reduce tensions with each other. So I'm hopeful that's, ballistic submarine base in Indian Ocean, there's so many assumptions in that basic description that I don't even want to go down that path. But China is, I'll just say as a backdrop, China is a very long way from projecting that kind of power into the Indian Ocean. Whether they eventually pursue that kind of interest, I don't know. But it's a very, very long-term prospect at best. Ma'am? Mm-hmm.
Why do you think the Chinese government doesn't see it as serious or
I think there are some Chinese elites who do.
okay, so why do you see that is there are there solutions to that? Are you confident?
No, it's one area where I'm not, from personal experience and from the recent experience, I'm not particularly, rosy-eyed about this aspect because we haven't seen the kind of progress that we had hoped for. But at the same time, almost all the views that I laid out are shared by some Chinese. I mean, it's a country of 1,300,000,000 people, right? I mean, you're going to have some Chinese who agree with you. So some issues more so than others. But there are Chinese elites who understand that to fight corruption, you need to have a freer press. There are plenty in the journalism community in China who certainly would like to have a freer hand to report on the local corruption of officials, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of religious freedom, another issue that, in my notes, but I didn't talk about, why do we say that religious freedom's in China's interest? Well, religious organizations independent religious organizations can play a huge role. They do in the United States, they do in Europe, they do around the world, in helping buffer the most vulnerable populations from some of the social and economic fallout of fast-paced economic change. So, and I think, again, there are Chinese citizens who understand this. And my only point is that I don't know of a better way, although it hasn't done, it hasn't produced the real concrete results. I don't know a better way of approaching the issue than to approach it in that spirit. To say, this is something that we've seen around the world that works. This isn't going to hurt China. It's not a Trojan horse that is going to lead to massive instability and destruction of your economy, and no one intends it that way. Just the opposite. Just the opposite. It's something that should shore up what you've achieved, and should be good for China as a nation, and should increase China's prestige on the international stage, because China quite justifiably gets criticized all the time for this stuff. So if you want to increase China's position in the international stage, improve your portfolio on this. And you'll learn over time that it doesn't harm you, that it could actually help you. It's a perfect example, and it's something that we worked very hard on while I was in the government. The question of Tibet, right? It's U.S. government policy that Tibet is part of China. Right? There's no issue there in terms of independence, et cetera, et cetera. But the U.S. government also pushes for more freedoms in Tibet, more real autonomy. It's in the Chinese constitution. There should be an autonomous region, and more religious freedom in Tibet, so that the Tibetan people will have more liberty. And of course, from the U.S. government position, it means more liberty within China. It means freedom in Tibet, not freedom for Tibet. Right? And it is my personal position, and it was part of our discussions, that the best bet for leading to long-term stability in Tibet is to deal with the Dalai Lama. Why? Because the Dalai Lama has publicly stated that he's not pursuing independence for Tibet. And he has consistently, in the last several years, eschewed violence as a means. So if you want to solve the problem from Beijing's perspective, they should deal with the Dalai Lama, who is not pushing for independence and who's not supporting violence. In fact, he said he would resign if the violence continued. And everybody was critical of the violence in Lhasa, around the world, the people in the governments around the world who saw what happened. And we were too. I mean, it's not a solution to Tibet's problems to have bunches of people running around looking for Han Chinese shopkeepers and pulling them out of their stores. Right? That was a very, very bad outcome. But it's notable that the Dalai Lama said it was a very bad outcome. So if they want to deal with this problem in a serious way, deal with the Dalai Lama. This Dalai Lama while he's alive. Otherwise, it could be a problem where they're dealing with someone who has a more expansive agenda or a divided movement that can't coordinate its policies. And that would probably lead to more instability moving forward. So that's the spirit, again, that we dealt with that issue. I don't think that's a sort of anti-China agenda. That's a pro-China agenda. Right? But that's the way it is. Gil.
How do you explain the gap between the progress you made in U.S. Chinese relations in the last few years and the coverage of it?
Don't get me started, Gil.
On the U.S. side, I would argue that on the Chinese side it's even more serious. That the world being presented in the Chinese media and academic discussion doesn't convey this progress and U.S. intention in any way right what you described.
Well, it's hard to get positive coverage of the Bush administration in American media. I don't know what better way to put it than that. That's true for China policy. It's true for another policy that's near and dear to my heart. That's Africa policy. The Bush administration's Africa policy has been tremendously successful. Aid has been tripled or quadrupled to Africa in this administration, and it's been linked to good governance in an effective way that makes the United States extremely popular, more popular than ever before in sub-Saharan Africa. Why isn't that on the front page of the news? I don't know. You can answer the question. I don't know. It's just not very popular to say popular things about the Bush administration.
But on the other hand, the Chinese side, they too are not covering this well, and they're making the world.
Well, I don't want to speak for the Chinese state media, which is what we're really talking about here, and it's difficult to say what drives them to publish certain things. There's an increasing debate in China. I think you'll see. I've seen when I was in Washington and subsequently a lot of articles that say that U.S. China relations are quite good, and you see a lot of articles that were worried about the campaign, right? Because there was going to be a change. How was it going to change? Was it going to change in a more hawkish way, in a more protectionist way? Why were those articles there? Because they were basically saying things were going well, and we didn't want to see instability. So I think there has been some coverage. I think it's tough for China in some ways, given their traditions and their and the controlled nature of the media, for them to say something like what I said on Darfur. Right? We had a really bad policy in 2006, and we changed it. Because the people who made the policy in 2006 are still in power. Right? And I think it was a really bad policy. I think it's changed for the better. But to drive home the point that it's improved for the better, I've got to point out how bad it was before. And that's not really part of their tradition. To say, boy, we were really screwing up for a while, and now we've started to do the right thing, and it hasn't hurt us too badly. Man. Uyghurs, yeah, that's correct. Very few people pronounce it correctly. Good job. I better not go there. Yeah, that's one that I wouldn't really feel comfortable talking about very much. There is a principle that says that you don't return people to countries where they may be subject to cruel punishment, torture, etc. So there is that as a backdrop. But I would not be able to talk about specific cases of Guantanamo detainees. Way in the back. Oh, this isn't quiet. This is bells and whistles, but go ahead. It's a tough challenge. I think that Secretary Paulson has done a very good job of explaining why the U.S. China relationship is important for the U.S. economy and for the Chinese economy and for the regional economies in East Asia. He has to counter a large amount of noise on the other side. And I give him tremendous credit for doing that. I think it becomes increasingly difficult when the economy is bad and people are losing jobs and they're looking for people to blame for losing those jobs, and I think that's going to become an increasing challenge. And I just hope, and I do hope, I don't say it as if I expect failure, I hope that President-elect Obama, when he becomes President Obama, will continue with this type of dialogue, will tell his colleagues in Congress, his current colleagues in Congress, and then they'll not be his colleagues any longer, that they need to understand the importance of this relationship. And it's an importance for the United States, it's an importance for China, it's also important from a basic global moral perspective. And this is something that's often left out of the equation, that hundreds of millions of people have been pulled out of abject poverty by Chinese growth in China and in the region around China. This is a very, very important trend in human history. Right? So people need to keep their eyes on that prize as well. So it's a good thing for us. It's a very good thing for those people who get pulled out of poverty. And I think that we need to keep that ship stable and afloat. It's going to take that kind of constant engagement, not only bilaterally, but also with the Congress, the media, et cetera, to keep it going, because there's obviously forces on the other side. You can turn on CNN at 7 o'clock and you'll see it. So, I can talk to elsewhere. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's always a concern about hyper-nationalism anywhere in the world, and that certainly applies to China. One of the problems is that you have a system that used to be communist ideologically, and it has moved away from communism, and that has left somewhat of a void in the ideational realm in China. That could be filled by a couple of things. One of them is a strong version of nationalism. Could be filled by religion, if there was more freedom of religion. It could be filled by a lot of things, but strong nationalism is one of the possibilities. So, yeah, that should be a concern to all actors around the world. And one of the ways to undercut hyper-nationalism is to have a good argument against it. And I think we currently have a very good argument against it, which is that no country in the world has done more for Chinese economic growth and for China's increased prestige on the international diplomatic stage than the United States. And I challenge anyone to come up with an answer other than China itself that is an answer to that. And I think that's something that is quite compelling. Now, of course, some people will never listen to reason and will say the United States is the source of all of our problems. But the United States, since 1978, has done a tremendous amount to help China increase its economic growth and to increase its place on the international stage. And that's something that isn't bad for the United States, so I'm not saying like we gave some enormous gift to China, but it helps counter the more raw versions of this type of nationalism. And I think you basically answered your own question when you said the Chinese government uses nationalism on occasion, but is quite nervous about it. They're very nervous about it, because really strong nationalists can easily turn against the Chinese government and blame them for not being sufficiently efficient in pursuing China's national goals as they see them, and maybe not sufficiently forceful in pursuing those national goals. And Chinese history is full of those examples. So I think they're quite nervous about it themselves. All right, Andy.
Thank you. Excellent presentation. I want to take back to the issue of climate change.
Yeah.
That's the issue coming up pretty quickly. The U.S. and China successfully with the protocol
Mm-hmm.
The Obama administration made clear that climate change is a priority for going forward. Recent statements by Woodrow and other kinds of officials have made clear that there's a pretty big gap where the Obama administration is and where China is.
Who has made that clear?
Sorry?
Who has made that clear?
Statements by the Obama administration and by Chinese officials, including Woodrow.
Mm-hmm.
There's a pretty big gap. The U.S. would like to see some kind of binding commitment, not a song that the U.S. song.
Mm-hmm.
China's not prepared to make that kind of commitment. What advice would you give to the Chinese administration to how to go about that?
Well, you have to do it through negotiations, right? That's the best way to do it. I don't think a lot of saber rattling and threats of punishment are going to answer the nail. I think it's going to take a tremendous amount of empathy on both sides. On the Chinese side, I think it's going to people are going to have to realize that Americans justifiably think that, yes, we emit a lot of the greenhouse gases around the world, but we also produce a tremendous amount of the growth that people have enjoyed around the world. and that we shouldn't be punished for producing that growth, which is still evident today in various countries, including China, who have benefited from a very strong U.S. economy. And one of the problems with Kyoto is that it rewound the film to a point before the U.S. economy really took off in the 1990s. And that's something that I think any administration is going to take on board in the future and say, that growth in the 1990s needs to be counted because it was not just good for us, it was good for everybody. And I think that's true. On the American side, I think there has to be a healthy recognition that China wants economic growth and that it has economic, political, and moral reasons for wanting to continue to produce economic growth, and economic growth requires energy consumption. And that's a non-starter. If your idea is somehow you're going to slow down Chinese economic growth, that's, if you're thinking about that as a solution, it's not going to go anywhere. So you have to have that kind of empathy going into the negotiations. Then the question of what are the solutions, and I would say that there's probably no more difficult, intellectually difficult problem that we're going to face than that one. There are lots of important problems that we have to deal with the Chinese government on: non-proliferation, the war on terror, lots and lots and lots of different things that we've got to deal with. And they're very important. There's lots of problems. In fact, there's really no major security issue around the world where we don't have to deal with the Chinese government. One of the big mistakes would be to say, well, we need to concentrate now on Afghanistan or Iraq readjustments, and we can't pay attention to China, because everything important has China involved in it. So you have to pay attention. But I think you need to come at it from that spirit, that they have interests that they're going to try to protect, and that you have to come up with that wind set, that overlapping wind set. And it's probably going to involve technology. It's probably going to involve improved intellectual property rights protection, as I suggested. And it's going to take a lot of imagination. So I'm hopeful they'll do that. President-elect Obama seems like a very smart man to me. And I hope he surrounds himself with smart people. And I would say that if the public reports are right, his China advisors are quite experienced, quite intelligent, and quite moderate people. And I'm encouraged when I see those public reports that those are the people he has chosen. And I hope those public reports are true. People like Jeff Bader, Richard Bush, these are highly talented, highly intelligent, highly experienced people who can get a lot of things done, and that makes me hopeful. Sir. What's a specific? I can talk about some things. On the 10-year framework, there isn't a tremendous amount to talk about yet, right? Because it's just being founded, right? There's going to be another round at the end of this year, I believe, Strategic Economic Dialogue, and it's just really just started. So no one's really being duplicitous with that. It's an idea that we should lock in a consistent dialogue with consistent goals. Then I'm not initially going to have binding specific commitments, I'm quite sure, because those are the hardest ones to get. But the idea that we're locking the two governments into a 10-year process is a very good idea. And it would be a good legacy, I think, of Secretary Paulson's efforts, which have been quite constructive. But I think that there's a reason, partially for confidentiality or secrecy reasons, they don't talk about all the details of the SED because they're confidential meetings. But also sometimes when it's a totally new initiative, there may not be all that much to say that would satisfy you, except to say that we're setting up a framework. They're setting up a framework, not we. I keep saying that because I haven't fully adjusted to the academic life. They're setting up a framework that will allow for more specifics moving forward. But I can tell you that Secretary Paulson's fully dedicated to this. And it was, as I said to the first questioner, it was front and center.
Our real bosses, Patty Elevich.
Oh, we can take a couple more.
Yes, we can. Suggested that we should.
We can take a couple more, right, Patty? Yeah, okay. Yes, sir. I need you to speak louder. I'm sorry, I'm getting old. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the arms sales to Taiwan were never frozen. No, they weren't essentially frozen. They weren't partially frozen. They weren't gelatinous. They weren't frozen. Those stories were already breaking when I was still in the government. They were just inaccurate, those stories. Well, think about delay. I'll be philosophical here because there's a limit to what I can discuss. publicly about this, but think about what delay means. We had a situation in which the United States government in April 2001 decided to sell a very large raft of defensive weapons to Taiwan. Policy that I thought was smart at the time, and I said so. The idea was to break out of this kind of year-to-year review of arms sales to Taiwan and allow them to purchase those weapons over a period of time when their budgets allowed, and we would be done with this. And Taiwan cared about its defense. The United States cared about Taiwan's defense. This seemed like a good, nice, elegant solution. Here's a bunch of things that you could do to shore up your defense. Then, in domestic politics in Taiwan, there was a freeze. This is a real freeze. There was a deadlock between the legislature, which was controlled by the opposition party, and the executive, which was controlled by the DPP. And nothing could get done for years and years and years. And then all of a sudden, the deadlock broke down, and you had the funds available for the entire raft, or practically the entire raft of systems. And this created this, it's like a dam breaking, right? So a huge flow. And some of the weapons were sold almost right away. Back in 2007, at a time of real political tensions and cross-strait relations, and in some real tensions between Washington and Taipei on some of the initiatives that were being pushed as part of the election campaign, $3.5 billion of U.S. weapons were notified to Congress by the administration. Historically, that's a very big package in terms of value. Then there was a portion of the package that wasn't notified. You got a new administration in Taiwan. Right? They just got on the ground. Didn't have a chance to talk to them yet. Right? Hear what their priorities are, what their concerns are. They're reaching out to the mainland. They're considering what they're going to do. You get a chance to have discussions with those people, figure out what they want to do, and the result of that series of discussions and that approach was another $6.5 billion or $6 billion in arms sales being notified to Congress, which is another big chunk of that initial package. Nothing was rejected. Right? Anything that's not currently on offer can be offered later by future presidents. And you have a total in 2.5 years, or no, not even 2.5, in 2 years, less than 2 years. You have a total of $9.5 billion being offered to Taiwan. Yet you hear all this squawking about how there wasn't a sufficient commitment, that there was a freeze, that there was nervousness. And I think, again, it's very important for Taiwan to deal with the mainland from a position of strength. And it's very important for Taiwan to be moderate. Why? Because a real peaceful process is what the bottom line is for the United States to get stability in the region. A real peaceful process. That can end up in any direction that anybody wants, as long as there's a peaceful process that both sides of the strait agree to. Right? Any settlement is fine. But you can't have a peaceful settlement of cross-strait differences if one side feels threatened. Right? So that's the spirit of the arms sales. But it doesn't mean that, therefore, the United States is supporting a unilateral change to the status quo on the Taiwan side. It doesn't. In fact, it was pretty clear in the last couple of years that the United States wouldn't support that sort of policy. So the key is, the mainland wants to convince Taiwan to do something that Taiwan currently doesn't want to do. It has to convince them through persuasion, not through coercion. And, maybe Taiwan wants to convince the mainland that it should be independent, and the mainland agrees. Who's the United States to get in the way? Right? But the two sides have to settle their differences, right? In one direction or another. And any settlement, any peaceful settlement of those differences would be accepted in Washington. There's all sorts of conspiracy theories that the U.S. will stand in the way no matter what. I don't see it. I didn't run into that conspiracy. I don't think it was above my clearance level. So. Okay, there's so many parts to your question. Now I get to be a China scholar, right? So, first of all, I don't agree with the premise that China has a long tradition of being closed off to the outside world. I think China has a mixed history. It's a long history, but it has huge tracts of its history that are very cosmopolitan. In fact, China is one of the more cosmopolitan cultures out there. It has a huge number of land borders with lots of different countries. It was invaded and occupied by other powers, and then they were brought into the Chinese system through, I don't know what persuasion, I guess, to adopt the Chinese system. So it has this very rich international history, China. So I wouldn't think that there's a long history, but there's a recent history of being closed off. So that would be the older generation, perhaps, that you're discussing. You know, the China of the 50s and particularly the 60s was a closed-off society. I think that was very unusual in China's history for China to end up in that place. And I do think that the fact that there are so many Chinese students in the United States, in Europe, Australia, Southeast Asia, everywhere, Korea, is great for China's future. I think it's one, I get a little sappy because I'm, an academic. I'm supposed to believe in this stuff, but I really do believe this. This kind of exchange of people is incredibly important. From academics to all sorts of people. I think business people in China, U.S. business people in China, do a tremendous amount of good for our diplomacy. Just by talking about their hometowns and how they're governed and how when the garbage doesn't get taken out, the local leader gets sacked, it's awfully helpful. And it's done in a kind of casual American way that is probably more convincing than when some senior official says, you need to do this, otherwise you're going to have trouble. So I just think that kind of integration, that kind of globalization that has affected China so much will bring China out of its shell and has brought China out of its shell. It's already a process that's happened, but it will continue to do so. And there'll always be the hothead nationalists as well in that process. Some who really are disgruntled at what they see outside of China, others who are nervous about their reputations, lest they be seen as too Western after spending long-term time in the West. It's a diverse place. You're going to have all these challenges. But I guess I'm optimistic about China's long-term future. And I think the real challenge is going to be getting to that long-term future without huge bumps in the road. And I can imagine a lot of bad scenarios. But I'm hopeful that those bad scenarios will work themselves out through the attention of Chinese citizens, Chinese elites, through international actors who care about the outcomes. I think it can work out. And that's why, as an official, you get out of bed every day in the morning, early, and as an academic, you do as well. And I think the two worlds are actually pulling in the same direction. So we probably don't have time for one more. Thank you very much for coming and for staying all this time and listening to me talk for so long. I appreciate it.
Thank you.